Welcome to Master of Science with host Professor James McCanney. The good professor's career spans 50 years as a university teacher, scientist, and engineer. Each week, he will explore the rapidly changing world of science as many long-held theories are crumbling under the weight of new data. He will cover the fields of geology, archaeology, meteorology, oceanography, space science, astronomy, cosmology, biological evolution, virology, energy, mathematics, and more. So please welcome the host of Master of Science, James McCanney.
Good evening, everybody. And tonight we're going to have a little fun. This is going to be interesting. What I'm going to do is go back in time a number of decades, maybe about 25 years, in fact, when I was a little bit younger, and people say I look better today than I did then, so you'll be the judge. But there were some talks I gave, some in front of fairly large crowds. I don't do so much of that anymore. This show is more my means of communicating with the public. But those were back in the days, the early 2000s, when one would travel for different venues to contact people because you didn't have this internet, this amazing, and that's the thing, a lot of young people don't understand what life was really like. I was just explaining the other day that when I was a kid, we didn't have air conditioning. You know, in the hot summertime, I remember there a hot August night up in the second floor of this old house where we lived, just sweating bullets, you know, and I just lay there and literally the bed would be wet from sweat because there was no air conditioning. That's just the way it was. And sometimes I'd go down and sleep on the back porch where it was a little bit cooler, but, you know, we're talking 95 degrees at night with high humidity. It was good for the corn. But that's what it was like back then. I had friends who they lived in what were called basement houses, but they couldn't afford to build the whole house, so they built the basement. They actually lived there until they were able to construct the entire house. And eventually they built a very nice house. You know, people don't realize what things used to be like. You know, kids today have this impression, and it's a false impression, that, you know, life in the suburbs with everything, all of the conveniences you have today with the cell phone, instant communication, you know, chatting with your friends online or watching shorts, that was not there, you know, even 10 years ago. So, you know, people have to understand what the past was like. But anyway, getting back to this idea that in the early 2000s, I gave a couple talks at what are known as the International UFO Congress. These were held at this particular time in Laughlin, Nevada, and I believe they're still continuing. I'm not sure where the venue is held today, but they're big events. And they bring in top talent from around the planet to talk. And so I was the lead speaker on this in 2 years in a row. So what I'm saying is my career goes back, in fact, decades prior to that. My public career began in 1979 when I was on the faculty of Cornell University. I was in the math and physics department faculty. And so that's like 46 years ago. And just to give you an idea, imagine there are people at NASA who had worked their entire career. In fact, after I was at Cornell, 1979 to 81, these people were still like in grade school. They would have gone to grade school, high school, got a degree in college, some kind of science degree, then went on and probably got a PhD in astronomy or maybe geology or something, then got a postdoc, and then eventually worked at NASA for their entire career, retired, lived in Arizona playing golf for a number of years, and died, all during the career that I had and still am going. And so I've seen a lot of people come and go over the decades. And a lot of people really mess up their own careers by being paid stooges for the scientific industry. This federal funding, and you can't say anything against the holy grail of the astronomical community because you'd lose your funding. And so they spent their entire career pounding out garbage science to you, the public. It's amazing. But at any rate, what I want to do for the next couple of weeks is pick out some of these old videos. And I don't have to create new content. A lot of what I do on this show is pick apart current events. And science today is kind of like, let's say like political humor. You know, these comedians that play on political characters and events and things like that. They have a never-ending supply of material because politicians are always messing up and saying something stupid or doing something stupid. It's constant, it's never-ending. So they always have a good supply. If you're a political humorist, you always have a good supply of material. Science is the same. And so, I mean, I have a list and list of topics that I could go through on this show. But what I want to show you now in some of these old videos where I was giving a lecture at some of these events is that I was talking the same talk back then. My story has not changed. And I knew the theoretical structure of the universe back in those days, what I call the Cornell days, and very important time because I came in there with my theoretical work in hand. I had been working on my own in celestial mechanics. And by the way, back in the earlier 70s, so literally 50 years ago, I was earning my title as professor as a very young person. And that has carried with me all through these decades. And people don't understand that now, you know, and I have a master's degree in physics, solid state, nuclear and solid state physics. And so back in those days, it was very common for people with master's degree to be teaching at the university level. I taught at Cornell with a master's degree, and the reason they liked me is because I was multilingual. I could teach science and math in a multilingual setting. And so it's not that uncommon. Now you have the plethora of PhDs. I mean, the glut. What other word can you use? Everybody's getting a PhD, and you have these huge numbers of PhDs to fill these positions, so they look down on somebody with a master's degree, but I have more experience than probably a lot of them put together because I was actually there when I had access to real data. A lot of them don't today. Data today is compartmentalized, and most PhDs today work in some narrow little field where they only see this little eensy-weensy teeny piece of the pie, and they learned what they learned in graduate school, and they have no concept of what's going on the rest of the planet. They only work in their little area, they get their paycheck, they work their entire lives, they retire, and like I say, I have outlived, there are people who were probably born after I was at Cornell, was raised, went to school, college, university, got PhD, postdoc, worked for NASA their entire career, retired, and died, all in the span of time. And now you see all these people leaving NASA because they're shutting it down. They're closing the doors on NASA, and for very good reason. But anyway, let me take you back to yesteryear to some of these, and I want you to pay close attention. This is material that's very relevant today, and that's the point. So I was talking about things that most people still don't understand today. So I don't have to create more content. And so a lot of the things like this poster behind me, this was the 30-year poster. Well, this was 20 years ago. When I was talking about probably about, maybe 15 years ago, would have a 30-year poster. It's, almost 20 years old now. So I've been around the block in the scientific community. Okay, so with that little bit of an introduction, watch this, and or if you're listening to one of the podcasts, listen to it. Listen to what I'm saying about science and the scientific, the condition of the solar system. And I want you to see what I knew then. And most of this material, like I say, came from material that was in line to be published, peer-reviewed journals in 1979. Okay, so without further ado, take a look at some of this material. This first one will be a closed meeting to a group of citizens, and this would have been in about the year 2001 at the release time, approximately the time I released what is now my first public book called Planet X, Comets, and Earth Changes. And of course, these are still available. My books, when I wrote them, were for all time. They were not written for a specific year or something like that. They were written so that in 100 years, 1,000 years, people would still be reading them as the basic understanding of how the solar system and universe works.
Welcome. Our speaker this evening, James McCanny, has done 3 decades of research on the electrical nature of the solar system, including celestial mechanics, plasma physics, and cometary physics. He earned his Bachelor of Arts degree with a double major in physics and mathematics from the St. Mary's University. And he had his Master's degree of Science in Nuclear and Solid State Physics from Tulane University. He has taught physics, mathematics, computer science, and astronomy at the university level. Half of his career was spent as an electrical engineer in the telecommunications industry. James McCanny was on the faculty for 2 years from 1979 to 1981 at Cornell University in the Physics and Mathematics Department, where he published and researched the beginnings of the electrical solar system model. At this time, I take great pleasure in introducing James McCanny, who will share with us some of his research and from his new book on Planet X, Comets, and Earth Changes. Thank you.
Thank you, and good evening. Appreciate everybody coming tonight. And first I want to mention that this is an extremely complicated topic. And the whole idea of Planet X and another planet somewhere in the outer solar system has been around for hundreds of years. We'll talk about some internal NASA studies that have been done over the years and identifying the object of Planet X. And also the current issue of Planet X, there's a good deal of talk about a very large rogue planet coming into the inner solar system in the very near future. And the dating of this is, of course, one of the big issues that has been talked about recently. There's internet activity, tremendous amount of internet activity on this. And so hopefully what I would do tonight is clarify a lot of these topics and put it into perspective and also give you a little bit of the history of where I've been with this topic. And much of the information that would be relevant to for the general public is contained in my book, Planet X, Comets, and Earth Changes. And that book was produced with a specific idea of clarifying this topic because there's so much misinformation out there at this point. At first, I would like to have a couple slides. We've got some computer graphics here. The picture we're looking at here is called the Eskimo Nebula, and many stars, including our own, look like this from a distance. There are sheaths of gas surrounding a central star, and you can see the central star as a glowing dot in the middle. Now, in reality, that star is almost a pinpoint in this picture, and much of the glow that you see around that central, what looks like the central star, would be almost probably as large as our entire solar system. So there's a lot of glow activity around there. But the idea here is that this is a cloud that is held back by solar wind from that star, and our star would look very much like that at a distance. And the idea is that our sun is electrical in nature. The clouds you saw around that star are what I call the electrical solar capacitor. In other words, the star is creating an electrical field, and this is something that is very diverse from what you would call standard astronomical theory, where they don't believe that there are any electric fields in the solar system. They talk in terms of magnetic fields. But the thing that I realized back in the 1970s, and this has come through my research on an ongoing basis up until the current day, is that the sun does in fact have an electric field, and when foreign objects come into that capacitor, they will discharge that capacitor, and that is what we call a comet. Now, the standard explanation for a comet in what you would call standard astronomical theory is a dirty snowball. It's a conglomerate of dust, snow, ices, and when it comes near the sun, it sublimates or melts, and then the melted material streams away from this object. And it's a very complicated topic because we're dealing with rarefied gases in outer space and a lot of data that has come in from space probes. The idea of my theory, or the standard theory, of course, says that the snow is melting away and therefore this ice ball is becoming smaller. It eventually melts away to nothing, and you might be left with some broken apart pieces of asteroidal material or possibly a single asteroid type of object at the end, and also that these objects are small. All of the comets are small. That's the standard concept of what a comet is. My concept is that when an object comes into our solar system from beyond and enters that large capacitor area, it discharges that capacitor and it draws in, by strong electrical forces, the tail material. Now, this is a picture of Hale-Bopp, and I'd like to keep it here for just a minute so we can talk about the structure of a large comet. Now, Hale-Bopp was a very large comet. Most comets only last for a couple of days, possibly a week, that they're visible, and then they go back out of the solar system. They're very small. The comet Hale-Bopp, which was here in the late 1990s, was visible for over a period of 6 years. That means that if the ice ball comet model were true, you would need some kind of object there to produce this massive tail, which at one point was 400 million miles long and close to a couple million miles wide. And it would have to produce that tail on and on and on, because it would be supposedly blowing away. It would have to produce that tail on an ongoing basis for 6 years. I personally don't believe that could possibly be true by any stretch of the imagination. But what you see here is a picture of Hale-Bopp taken with what is called a Swan filter. It only sees ionized water. And what you see are these tremendous fingers of material being drawn in, and they're also in a helical shape. Now, if you took a movie of this, repeated pictures of the comet Hale-Bopp, those tentacles would be out there whipping around like this, like big snakes. And this goes back to the ancient legends where they talk about the big comets. Now, we have not seen big comets bigger than Hale-Bopp in the solar system in our scientific lifetime. That is back to the age of Galileo when he first used a telescope. So Hale-Bopp is probably one of the biggest comets we have seen in the solar system in our scientific history. The ancients talk about huge comets and the effect they have on Earth. Now, there again, standard science claims that comets are little, that unless they hit us directly, there won't be any damage to Earth. That if they go whisking by, even if they're 100,000 miles away, a close flyby, so to speak, that we will go relatively unharmed. I want to read a couple passages from a historic record, and this is relative to what they called at that time the destroyer. And it refers to the Great Flood,
which we had on Earth. And there again, what are comets? Primarily water. And the reference that I make, and of course this has been made before, to the Great Flood is that it was caused by a very large comet that encountered Earth. And the pollution event that occurred at that time, part of it was the hydrocarbons, the oil that came raining in, the fire and brimstone, the meteor streams, and also the tremendous amount of water that came into Earth from outside as this very large comet encountered Earth. And in somewhat the recent past, this is the quote from the translation of an ancient text, and there are many of these. Then with the dawning, men saw an awesome sight. There, riding on a black rolling cloud, came the destroyer, newly released from the confines of the excuse me, of the sky vaults. Excuse me. And she raged about the heavens, for it was her day of judgment. The beast with her opened its mouth. And now this line is very interesting because it indicates there were two of them, not just one. There was, and this is something I'll talk about a little bit later, that these come in multiples. Comets, the big comets typically have companions, and they come in multiples. The beast with her opened its mouth and belched forth fire and hot stones and the vile smoke. It covered the whole sky, and the meeting of the place of earth and heaven could no longer be seen. In the evening, the places of the stars were changed. They rolled across the sky to new stations. Then the floodwaters came. The floodgates of heaven were opened, and the foundations of earth were broken apart. The surrounding waters poured over the land and broke upon the mountains. The storehouses of the winds burst their bolts asunder, lightning bolts. So storms and whirlwinds were loosed. And this is something I go into also. Part of my theoretical work is showing how electrical activity in the solar system directly affects our weather. And that is that comets can affect the sun. The sun will send out solar flares. Those solar flares directly affect our weather. And I have some examples here of, for example, how hurricanes have formed directly as a result of solar flares hitting Earth. And these are the historical records of those kind of events when a large comet is in the solar system. So storms and whirlwinds were loosed to hurl themselves upon the earth. In the seething waters and howling gales, all buildings were destroyed. Trees were uprooted and mountains cast down. There was a time of great heat, then came bitter cold. The waves over the waters did not rise and fall, but seethed and swirled. There was an awful sound above. And there are records like this that abound. What modern science says is this is folly. These people didn't know what they were talking about. None of this happened. The historical records from every civilization that we know about talks about the Great Flood. And I talked with a history teacher in Florida who teach honors high school history, and I looked in their history book and I went way back to the beginning and I said, where's the part about the flood? She said, oh, that's just fable. We don't talk about that. Thank you. So at any rate, that's a little bit of an introduction to the topic of Planet X. The idea of another planet, one we call Planet X, which does not have a name, that is a rogue planet that might come into the solar system and affect us. The search for Planet X has been around for hundreds of years. And NASA has had internal studies. I'll talk a little bit about that and talk about internal documents that I have relative to that. But the interesting thing is, when approached, they send sometimes representatives who are either amateurs or not employed by NASA. But NASA to date has not given an official NASA statement from the official NASA news release agencies, which would be at either Goddard Space Flight Center or JPL, the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. They have not given an official NASA release on their opinion of Planet X. And there's a good reason, because they are seeing these objects and they're not telling us about it. They are actually under contract not to tell us. In the late 90s, NASA scientists and employees were all forced, in a sense, to sign non-disclosure agreements under the NSA, which are basically security agency agreements. And they are not allowed to talk to the public about anything that would be threatening to Earth. All of this has to come out of news release agencies. At any rate, I'd like to point at a poster over here that I took to a meeting, the American Geophysical Union meeting in 1997, and I go sometimes to these meetings, although what I want to point out is that I'm never allowed to talk at these meetings. What's interesting is they have a thing called a poster session where you take a poster and you have a table in a big conference room, and you can stand there for 4 days during this conference, and people are allowed to come up to you and talk. But the interesting thing about this conference was I wasn't allowed to talk. They never told me when the news release meetings would be, and those were held behind closed doors. And when I stood at my table, I could always see NASA officials standing off, keeping the young scientists from getting near me. This is the poster I took, and it is a very large, colorful poster, as you can see. It's about 4 feet high and about 6 or 7 feet wide. And basically, on that poster, I outline all of the basic information regarding my solar system model and comet model. I'm not sure if we can zone in on the picture that's on the bottom right. Can we scan in on, yeah. Now this is something I've actually included on the cover of my book, and it is an Indian rock painting from Green River, Utah, and it clearly shows 2 large comets there. And my book explains why this is a very significant piece of data in astronomical terms, but you can see the 2 comets, the long broom-like objects, and they both have squiggly sunward spikes. Now, we've seen sunward spikes with comets before, but not the squiggly kind, which indicates an extremely high magnetic field associated with that comet. The other thing that these 2 comets show, one has a large nucleus that is visible. Now, the artist drew this twice, so there's no mistake that he intended one to be with a nucleus and one without. Now, these are fully developed, very large comets, and the point is that that comet is probably at least 100,000 miles across, possibly larger. So if you can see the nucleus, that would indicate that that is an extremely large celestial body as the nucleus of that comet. This is scientific data, and I include it on the cover of my book, and then that's essentially a way of combining the past with the present. And that's a lot of what this is about, combining the information we've gotten from ancient civilizations with modern science and bringing it all together. The next thing I would like to do is take a globe, which I brought as a prop, and talk about the solar system just a little bit. We're all familiar with this globe and the fact that the Earth sits on a 23.5-degree angle with the plane of the planet. So let's pretend that the sun is way out there, and this is the Earth. Let me move my cup here. And this would be the position of Earth in summer if the sun is over there. In other words, the northern hemisphere is receiving the sun from that side, and the southern pole of Earth is pointing down at a direction down there. I want to read an internal report. This is from 1991, October. It's a NASA internal document. Title of the topic, or the topic is, the abstract is Search for Planet X. Robert S. Harrington, Naval Observatory, Washington, D.C. And it gives the number of the report. And of course, anything that's done with NASA is done under contract, so he is under contract from NASA to discover this planet. And I just want to read the abstract because it's very revealing. By the way, he never was allowed to complete his measurements on this. The observation of the region of the sky in which it is believed planet X should now be, based on perturbations observed in the motions of Uranus and Neptune, was determined, and there is no reason to update that determination. And what this is basically saying is they had gone through about 10 years of study watching the motion of 2 planets in our outer solar system. And what I want to mention is as they moved around in their orbits, they were pulled down like this. In other words, there had to be something very large and down below the solar system. And it happened, well, let me continue reading. A limited area of that region was photographed, and that will be continued. A given area is photographed with the twin 20-centimeter astrograph in New Zealand on 2 successive nights near the time that area is in opposition, and these places are blinked in Washington to identify anything that has moved. And this is a method they use to observe movement of objects like comets. And the predicted region is in the south, which requires observations from the southern station, and it is in opposition in the April to June period, which means that observations have not yet started for the year. This was in October of 1991, so it was too early for the April to June measurements. Blinking will be done as soon as the plates are received in Washington. Okay, so now what he is saying is if that's the sun, here's Earth, and the South Pole would be pointing down in this direction. What he is saying is if you look at the southern hemisphere of Earth, well, basically, the only points on Earth that you could possibly see this from would be the very southern tip of South America or the very southern tip of New Zealand. Now, they had equipment in New Zealand, and that's why they went to New Zealand. But what you can see is that there's no other place on the planet that you could view this object from at any time during the year, because it's a very closed window. It's from April to June, basically the month of May, and from the very southernmost points in the world, and all the rest of this is ocean. Southern tip of South America actually goes a little farther south, but that's very uninhabitable area down there, the southern tip of Patagonia. And you can see that Africa is actually way too far north, the southern tip of Africa. So at any rate, the thing I want to point out is that the studies that were done were looking for a region in the sky very far south of, and it was only visible from that particular area. The other thing it points out is that NASA did have internal studies going back into the 80s looking for specifically Planet X. Another thing, let's go to the next slide. This is a picture of the Atlantic Ocean with 4 hurricanes in it. In May of, I believe it was 1999, I made a prediction based on my electrical theory of the solar system. And I said that there was a small comet, Comet Lee, which had a very unusual orbit. It came down below Earth's orbit and would be directly in line with Earth and our moon. So the alignment would have been the comet, Earth. Our moon would have been going through a new moon phase, which meant the solar wind would come in, hit the Earth, the moon, then the Earth, and cause an excited time in our, on our planet electrically. We were also in a direct alignment with Venus and Mercury. So we had an amazing alignment of planets and a comet. And I said, on that date, September 6th, we will see very excited hurricane activity in the solar system, or on planet Earth, due to solar system electrical activity. And on that date, September 6th, 4 hurricanes originated in the Atlantic. One of them was Floyd, which just about devastated Florida and flooded most of the New England states. The reason I want to mention that is because since I have done repeated studies on the relationship between solar activity and storms on Earth, this is called the Sun-Earth connection. It's an activity that is very highly studied by NASA these days. And I believe I had the answers to all of these theoretical questions as early as 1979 on how the Earth responds to solar activity in causing severe weather. We just had tornadoes here the other day. The solar storm hit. We had tremendous tornadoes that came across, in fact, Minnesota and into Wisconsin, destroying entire towns in their path. And we've seen this before. So anyway, I just want to mention that. My book covers that topic, the topic of Earth weather. So when you read the ancient accounts and you read the scientific information that is coming forth regarding the electrical nature of the solar system, what I've done with my book is basically put this in the chronological order of how I came to understand these principles and the ancient texts, how they have to be true, and how the ancient stories of the Earth, what we call Earth changes, dramatic Earth changes, mountain building. I also go through some of the theories like, for example, mountain building and plate tectonics. If the Earth formed all at one time 4.5 billion years ago and nothing happened since, then you would expect the Earth to be a nice smooth globe, as smooth as a billiard ball, and you would not have the upthrust mountains, nor would you have plate tectonics, because as it cooled, everything would have shrunk. The plates would have shrunk away from each other. And what we're finding is these plates are wrenched up over one another. And so the cause of mountains is a topic of discussion, and the fact that the movement of plates are not really caused by some under-Earth force, but they are the result of an event that happened with Earth where the Earth's mantle was actually moved by a large object coming by, forcing a gravitational wave into the surface of the Earth and wrenching it. There's the topic of pole shifts. We have magnetic pole shifts and geographical pole shifts that we know happened on Earth. The topic is, did the Earth do this on its own, or did something come by and cause this? It's very interesting that in the, for example, Siberia, northern Russia was a tropical climate when we had our supposed ice age here. What's becoming clear is that the Earth was wrenched in this direction, and now the North Pole is in a very different spot, and when that ice cap melted, it basically left us with these huge lake areas that we find up in this region north of Wisconsin. And what happened to Siberia is it was wrenched up into Arctic climate overnight, and we have mastodons, which were tropical animals, frozen 20 feet in the tundra with tropical plants in their mouth, undigested, and the meat was so freshly preserved that they were still using it in the 1900s when the Trans-Siberian Railway was built as food. In fact, the mastodon meat was even sold in French markets as a delicacy. So that's how quickly those animals were frozen during this event. What we're learning is that the history of the Earth that we're being taught as standard information could not possibly be true. In the Antarctic, what we're learning is that the Antarctic ice cap is no more than 4,000 years old, and there's a freshwater lake about the size of Lake Superior, unfrozen under 2 miles of solid ice with an ice dome. It's called Lake Vostok. The Russians had a base there above that lake on the ice cap as early as the 1950s, and the Americans now have a base down there, and they're trying to research this lake that's down under 2 miles of solid ice. So at any rate, the whole point of this talk is to give an introduction. My book covers all these topics and more, and what I'd like to do now is open up for questions from the audience. Once again, the book is called Planet X, Comets and Earth Changes, and it is written for the general public. The last third of the book is more technical, and that would be for people with degrees or people who want to see some of the technical background, and the very technical papers are not included in this book at all. The papers that would be, say, for example, critical to a scientific conference. So with that in mind, what I'd like to do is open this up for questions and
Okay, thank you very much. Why does NASA not tell us about Planet X?
basically they're under a contract to, like I said, that if anything dangerous is out there, anything of danger, they have to go through a very set filter of information. So you couldn't go up to a NASA scientist and say, do you know about this? Also within NASA, there's a very structured layer of knowledge. So there's only a very few people that even know about it. So you have the base working force of NASA who doesn't even know about this. And so the data that comes in is filtered from the top down. And so many of even the top scientists, I've found people on, for example, the Deep Space Impact Program, which deals with things that should affect Earth, who don't even know the pixel count on the Hubble Space Telescope. So, I mean, these are things that are held very secretly, even within the layers of NASA.
What level of damage could be expected from this Planet X?
Well, from that, we can look at two things, both the modern theory of how the solar system works and what would happen if a large object came by, the gravitational effects like the pole shift, and flooding, because comets are primarily water, and hydrocarbons, the pollution event. There's a whole myriad of effects. Electrical effects, we know from historical record that the ancients saw electrical discharges between the planets. The Zeus throwing lightning bolts across the sky. We know from historical record that the ocean levels rose 400 feet in a very short period of time. Much of that is attributed to melting of the glaciers during the last ice age, but they really don't account for a 400-foot rise in the oceans. We had a tremendous flood. All the ancient civilizations talk about it. So there's a wide scale of effects. Once again, my book has an entire chapter on Earth changes. That's what we call the Earth changes that might be expected if a large object comes by Earth.
When will Planet X arrive, and is there just one Planet X?
Let me answer the second question first. Typically, these large objects have large gravitational fields, so they've amassed a collection, an entourage, so to speak, of objects that are orbiting with them. So when they come in, they are not alone. We saw this with the large comet Hale-Bopp, which came in with a companion. We know there's a companion. First, NASA denied there was a companion, and ultimately, they came out with papers of their own showing that there was a companion. But the point is that these very large objects have a whole entourage of objects. And I'm sorry, the other question, when will it arrive? We do not have right now specific data on arrival date. There are some people who are projecting a May of 2003 arrival date, and that is not confirmed in a scientific sense that we have an orbit and an object identified. It would be very difficult to imagine something this big, that close to the solar system that we haven't seen yet. But the other thing I want to point out is that if Harrington was right and this object is coming in from that direction, then the only time you could see it is in the month of May from those very southerly points on the Earth. So the answer is we don't know. We're going with some very secondary information at this point on the arrival of a new large planet.
Why have we not seen Planet X?
Well, that's related to the same issue. There's one statement that comes out of standard astronomy, and that is that it would take a long time for this object to come into the inner solar system, so we would have possibly years of advance notice. And once again, if astronomers are not savvy to the size of these objects, there's another possibility that one of these very large objects could be coming at a high rate of speed, something we have never seen before. And so it could get here very fast, and this is something that there's a possibility. We don't know. At this point, we're just looking for possibilities. But the problem here is that NASA has a history going back into the Hale-Bopp days of hiding information, and so nobody trusts them anymore.
By the way, where can we get your book?
The book is available, possibly in the near future it'll be available in bookstores, but right now it's available on my webpage, which has more information and lectures. But the webpage is jmccanney science, jmccannyscience.com. And it's the price of the book is $17.95 plus shipping. It's usually like a $4 shipping charge anywhere in the 50 states. But that's the only, there are other outlets at this time, but at the current time, that's the only available place. I want to make a summary here. I appreciate everybody coming today. And I know there's a tremendous amount of interest in this topic. The other thing I want to say is that if you want information on Planet X, there's a tremendous amount of misinformation floating around on the internet. And just be wary of what you listen to. There are people who claim to have maps of safe zones where you could go and be safe from any Planet X. That is, there's no way anybody can predict any of this. It's a very unpredictable science, because the main reason, if a comet comes in, we know from scientific data that comets change their orbits. The large comet Hale-Bopp changed its orbit on a daily basis, and it changed its orbit from a 4,200-year period to a 2,600-year period in one revolution of the sun. So it changed very rapidly. And the other thing is, we know that the original estimate that Hale-Bopp would arrive at its closest point to the sun was in December of, I believe, 1990, was it 98? And it was a month late. It was an entire month late in arriving because it had slowed down due to the tail drag of this large comet. So to predict when exactly something is going to be here, even if we saw something today coming into the solar system when we had an orbit, we would not be able to predict the exact day or hour it would arrive. Once again, I thank you for coming, and like I say, most of the information on this for the general public is in the book, Planet X, Comets and Earth Changes. And like I say, that was written for the general public, and also a first tier of scientific information for people that are a little more savvy with astronomical terms and scientific data. Thank you. We're going to come back from break here and have another small question and answer period, and cover some of the topics that we discussed during the break. Once again, this is a huge, very complicated topic. Literally thousands of researchers have worked around this topic, both within the government-sanctioned scientific organizations and outside. And there's a lot of name-calling and sometimes even a bit of bitterness that goes on because of the history of all of this. It's a tremendously complicated historical topic relative to what has happened to Earth. NASA has its story. They tend to stick with the idea that asteroids have to hit Earth to cause damage, or comet nuclei, whatever. And that they also tend to stick with the story that the damage from outside has been relatively minimal in terms of large objects coming by. In fact, they don't acknowledge the fact that there could even be a large object that could come by. So, like I say, you could spend literally years and years just researching the convoluted history of all of this. But what's very interesting is it does go back to kind of a starting point back in the late 1940s and early 1950s, when a man named Emanuel Velikovsky, who was one of the very early pioneers in this field, wrote 3 books. They're called Worlds in Collision, Ages in Chaos, and Earth in Upheaval. In the first book, Worlds in Collision, basically stated that the planet Venus was once a very large comet, that it came out of the planet Jupiter, something that seems highly improbable, and ravaged the solar system, causing the Great Flood. It was here during the Exodus, and many of the Earth changes that occurred during that time were caused by the planet Venus. You have the Egyptians, we have the legends that come from Egypt talking about the planet Nibiru. We have the references in the Old Testament that talk about the giant planet Wormwood, which ravaged Earth and poisoned the waters of Earth, which is literally the definition of wormwood, is the poisoner of waters, and that's right in Revelations. So no matter what religion or ethnic group or culture you look at, they all talk about this. What's very interesting is in the 1990s, the Vatican very quickly and at great expense built a large professional grade observatory in Arizona and staffed it with professional astronomers for the primary purpose of watching the comet Hale-Bopp. And their specific request to NASA was, is Hale-Bopp wormwood? In a nutshell. So in other words, they wanted to know if Hale-Bopp was the historical planet wormwood. And of course, the Vatican is very tuned to a lot of this stuff. And like the original text that I read here was from a translation of a Bible called the Colburn Bible, which was basically text from Joseph of Arimathea, who kept them in England during the Roman conquest of Europe back in the time of Christ. So at any rate, what I'm telling you here is there's such an incredible history to this entire topic, and the camps of yes, it happened and no, it happened, that you could spend literally the rest of your life studying this. One thing I want to mention is many of the professional astronomers have not gone and done this work, and that's part of the problem, that we are talking to people who are not well versed in this incredible rich history. So with that, what I'd like to do is open it up to further questions, and I think we'll touch on some topics that of interest here.
Okay, my question is that with our knowledge of what they have with HAARP, can you explain how this might tie into some of the problems we have now with all the, well, a lot of things can happen just
with weather? Are you
yes,
asking?
Weather and
okay,
other things that they can impose on us down here.
Right, and actually last night the Russian, is it called Duma, made a public international statement to Washington and basically told them stop HAARP research. I don't know if you saw that. This came out last night. I do all my work at night. I watch the sun at night through the satellites, and I watch the worldwide weather. I study the weather. I have capability of looking at the entire Earth, pretty much numerous satellites that monitor the sun, and I can watch all of this proceeding and working on Earth's weather. The whole issue of HAARP is that they are able to, from Alaska, bounce high-frequency waves around and change basically the dielectric nature of the atmosphere. What is going on is there's a huge pent-up electrical capacitor in our ionosphere, and basically they have the trigger to release that energy. And they're starting to use that, and they can direct those beams to various parts of the globe. And so now what they're doing is they're in a position to launch satellites that can direct those beams down from space, and Russia is saying no. This happened last night.
Why?
Because it also has the effect, electrical fields we know affect people's psyches. We know from full moon, that any police station on the planet will tell you during a full moon we have heightened activity of crimes, etc. So the thing is, these high frequency waves can also affect people. And so there's a whole lot of unknown knowledge here, and they're playing with fire, so to speak. They got matches, they're playing with fire, they don't know what they're doing. So relative to weather, HAARP is very overstated in the fact that it causes weather. It does not cause weather. It has the ability to influence the atmosphere that can change atmospheric conditions that can release weather energy into our atmosphere. And people are playing with this who don't really know what they're doing. They're at the very early stages of understanding in the physics sense. And Russia is literally telling them to stop. So, on an international basis, because they consider it a weapon. So, thank you for the question.
You mentioned earlier that very large objects can come into our solar system at very high speeds. If a very high mass object were coming into our solar system at a very high speed, what would keep that object from being torn apart by the high gravitational forces and other forces that would be affected on it as it approached very rapidly?
Well, one thing is the loosely knit entourage of objects can be pulled away if, say, it came by Jupiter or something like that. And in fact, that's what I believe happened 3,600 years ago, is we had many objects in the solar system at one time. We had the major object, which apparently was Nibiru, which is a very massive planet. Some people call it a brown dwarf. I don't think anybody really knows what it is. And this is, once again, really from legend. And if NASA has seen this, they haven't told us. So we're working on partial information here. But the point was that both Hale-Bopp and another very large comet were in the solar system at that time. And I believe that's why that artist drew two pictures of a comet. There were actually two comets in the solar system, one where you could see the nucleus, one where you could not. And they both had the squiggly sunward spike, which I'm saying is an electrical effect. But the point is, unless you know many of the properties of these objects, it's hard to say why wouldn't it be ripped apart, or why wouldn't it say rip Earth apart, or other things like that. It's just really, if we had data, then you could start to make estimates. We don't have data at this point. That's the bottom line. And so to talk about objects theoretically is very difficult. Yes?
Okay. You mentioned earlier the quick frozen mastodons, but also the worldwide reports of massive flooding. What I heard research that said that it was a crust shift, not a pole shift. Flamis did all this work, and they were saying that Atlantis went south. It was a crust shift. Now, how do you make that difference between a pole shift and a crust shift? It seems like a pole shift is going to be a massive amount of mass have to shift like that, and that would be kind of hard to conceive of coming up.
The question is relative to actually the process of a pole shift, and we're talking about a physical pole shift of the surface of the planet as opposed to a magnetic pole shift, which has to do with the magnetic field of the planet. But basically, the Earth is like an egg. It has a shell, which we call the mantle, and under the shell there is a thicker crust, which is solidified. Now, I want to make a point that if you took a big saw and you could cut a piece of the Earth out and try and lift it up, it would not lift like a rock. It would all crumble into a million pieces. In fact, if you went to the Rocky Mountains, which is one of our larger mountain chains, and you tried to dig rock out of there, basically it would all crumble. The Earth is not a solid piece of material at all. And so when something shifts, now the other point is that just underneath the crust is a very viscous layer of fluid molten material, and that's where the volcanic lava comes from that flows up through the holes that we call volcanoes. So the point is that as an object comes by, the gravitational wave from this object will be set up in the outer mantle, just like a tidal wave in the ocean. And as that wave rolls at about 1,000 miles an hour, let's take the Rocky Mountains right here, as that wave would roll up, eventually it would hit that obstruction, and that energy would go into that location. And that's when you look at the Rocky Mountains, there are old volcanoes, there are new upthrust mountains, there's a conglomerate of types of mountains that are in the Rocky Mountains and all the mountain chains. They were not built all at one time. They were built by repeated and repeated and repeated incidents of objects coming by Earth, forcing gravitational waves into the surface. If the planet formed, as NASA says, where it formed all at one time and started to cool, you would not have plate tectonics that crunch up against each other. They would be cooling and moving away from each other on all fronts. And you would not have the upthrust mountains that we see. So, at any rate, what happens then is a large object comes by, sets up a gravitational wave in the crust and the mantle, and it literally shifts. Now, as the Earth is spinning, let's spin it like, actually this is the direction it's spinning in its normal daily routine. The inner part of the Earth is going to continue to rotate during this process. The outer shell is going to shift, and then it will grab onto the inner part again, and the Earth will continue to rotate once again. So you will see a very sudden, very dramatic change. And apparently what happened during the last incident when the mastodons were frozen overnight is the object either had to come over the Earth like this, throwing Russia up like this and the rest of the Earth in a motion like this, or it had to come under the Earth. Because we know that Antarctica was a more tropical type of climate at the same time also. And that's why there's tremendous interest there right now, is because they are in fact digging up what is down there, and it's a highly secret operation. So at any rate, I hope that answers your question a little bit on what happens. Of course, there are other facts. There's some misconceptions out there that somehow the magnetic field of the Earth is coupled with the Earth, and a large magnetic response would cause the Earth to shift poles. The Earth's magnetic field is very loosely coupled with the physical Earth itself. We have loosely deposited regions of iron and nickel in the surface, and when you hold a compass, that's what you're reading. And there's a magnetic field down at the core, but most of the magnetic field of the Earth is bound in electrical currents that flow up in the ionosphere and above. So when somebody talks about a magnetic pole shift causing the Earth to shift, it's a total misnomer, because the Earth's magnetic field is not bound to the Earth. It's not like a little pocket magnet that you had when you were a kid that's a little hunk of iron. It's not like that. It's very loosely bound. What you would get are localized wrenching of the Earth's surface due to magnetic effects, and those could trigger volcanoes and earthquakes. The other thing I want to mention about earthquakes and volcanoes is they are like, in a sense, a loaded gun. They have a very low energy mechanism that, if tripped, can release a tremendous amount of energy. So when these earth changes occur, that's why you can have tremendous earthquake activity and volcanic activity, is because you're tripping those little triggers that then allow those processes to release very large amounts of energy. And that's very much like HAARP, where you have a very small amount. It's like starting a fire with a match. You have a small amount of energy, you have a vast storehouse of stored energy, and you're releasing it by touching that match to the wood. Very similar. Any other questions?
Well, I have lots of them, but anyway. The North Pole is open now. The water is there, and I just heard yesterday that could be, if this continues, that there would be a way to go over the pole.
The North Pole is, and once again, regarding glaciers, the melting of glaciers, global warming, it is my position that we are relaxing from a very deep freeze event. In fact, right here it says in that old texture, and then there was a big deep freeze afterwards, and we know that. We know there was a mini ice age where the Earth was partially covered with ice. And my opinion is we are just getting back to normal. The global warming that we're seeing is far too rapid for the greenhouse effect to account for it. And so what we're actually doing is getting back to normal, and we know from the time of the dinosaurs that the Earth was pretty much all tropical. And that's where we're going to right now. We're actually going to that state. The Antarctic ice sheet is slipping off of the Antarctic continent. And that's because that continent is warm. If that had built up over millions and billions of years being at that location, then the land mass would be cold and it would not be slipping off. We would not have a lake the size of Lake Superior under the ice, unfrozen Lake Vostok sitting under 2 miles of ice. We wouldn't have that. Literally, none of this makes sense unless you come to the conclusion that something happened. And there again, it's a very complicated topic. There's very many opinions, and I don't think we have all the solutions and answers at this point. But I can tell you one thing, that standard science is holding and impeding the progress that we have to make in moving in the direction of understanding what really happened to this planet and our civilizations, which is one more point. Maybe I'll end with this. That there's a lecture I used to do in my astronomy classes. I'd take a whole day to do this. I'd start out and I'd say, let's go back 10 years and look around you and see what was not here. People could mentally do that. And I'd say, okay, now let's go back 20 years and let's talk about what was not here and what was here 20 years ago. Let's go back 50 years, let's go back 75 years, 100 years, and then I start taking them back in history And we talk about the various areas on Earth. You get back into the pre-Middle Ages Europe, the Black Forest was impenetrable. There were tribes living there, but the forest itself went back into antiquity. And what you find are small population centers around the globe. And then I talk about, when did these civilizations realize that the next guy over there existed? In other words, when did the civilizations make contact? The Chinese, the Tibetans. So the point is, the students one by one began to realize that these races had developed independently, and it did not come from one central source that came out of Mesopotamia a number of thousands of years ago. All these civilizations were in place and developed, and the only explanation is that Earth had worldwide civilizations. Prior to an event, Earth went through a catastrophic change, and what we see today is growing out of those remaining civilizations. Thank you.
Okay, so hope you enjoyed that. And once again, over the next couple of weeks, I'll be continuing with some of these oldie movies of myself talking, and giving a very firm understanding of how the solar system and the universe works. So join me for the next few weeks, and then after that, I've got some surprises coming in the shows that will be coming after these historical important shows.
This has been Master of Science with host James McCanney. Join us each week as James will delve into historical figures such as Nikola Tesla, Albert Einstein, and the great mathematicians as we explore the history of man, Earth, and our universe as you've never seen it before. Tuesdays, 7 p.m. Eastern.